Hello and welcome to the channel. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now for you? I love seeing people tuning in from all around the world. Today, we're going deep into a story that's bigger than movies, bigger than legends, the truth about the mafia and how they still control money today. Most people think the mob died decades ago, but what if I told you it never went away? It just got smarter. Let's get started. The mafia is one of the most misunderstood institutions in modern history. To many, it looks like something that belongs only in old black and white photographs, faded mugshots, and gangster movies with men in fedoras holding Tommy guns. But the reality is more complicated. The mafia was never just about violence, extortion, and shootouts in the streets. It was, and still is, about control. Control of money, control of power, and control of opportunity. In order to understand how the mob still influences money today, we first need to travel back, not just to the days of Al Capone or Lucky Luciano, but to the very roots of organized crime itself. Because once you see how it started, you'll see why it never truly ended. The origins of the mafia lie in Sicily, an island in the Mediterranean where for centuries distrust of government authority shaped local life. The Sicilian mafia didn't begin as a group of flashy gangsters. It started as a secret society that promised protection in a world where the law could not be trusted. In villages where governments were corrupt or absent, mafia groups offered security and justice for a price. Over time, this shadow system became more powerful than the actual state. Money flowed through it, loyalty sustained it, and violence ensured its survival. When waves of Italian immigrants moved to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they carried these traditions with them. What had started as a response to weak authority in Sicily transformed into a global enterprise in America. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, poor immigrant neighborhoods struggled against discrimination and poverty. Local gangs sprouted up, many of them loosely based around ethnicity or nationality. Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, Italian gangs, all of them fought for control of territory. But the Italians had something unique: the structure of the Sicilian mafia. They didn't just fight for turf, they created a hierarchy. They built families that weren't related by blood, but by oath, a bond sealed with loyalty that often meant more than life itself. At the bottom were the soldiers, the workers who carried out the daily jobs of gambling, extortion, and protection. Above them were the capos, who managed crews. At the top sat the boss, the man who controlled the flow of money and power. Around him stood the underboss and the consigliere, an advisor who often kept things running smoothly. This structure allowed the mafia to operate like a corporation, except instead of boardrooms and quarterly reports, their meetings took place in dimly lit backrooms, and their contracts were enforced with blood. When Prohibition hit America in 1920, the mafia discovered its golden opportunity. With alcohol banned, the public's thirst didn't disappear. It only created demand for a new supplier, and the mafia was happy to step in. They smuggled liquor from Canada, ran hidden breweries, and controlled speakeasies. This was the moment the mafia transformed from local street gangs into national empires. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York became household names, both feared and admired. Money poured in by the millions, And once the Mafia realized the power of controlling entire industries, they never let go of that model. But here's where the story becomes important for today. The Mafia learned a crucial lesson during Prohibition, that controlling money was far more powerful than controlling streets. Violence brought attention. Money brought silence. Politicians could be bought, police officers could be bribed, and judges could be influenced. And so, even when Prohibition ended in 1933, the Mafia didn't collapse. They simply shifted. Instead of bootlegging liquor, they moved into unions, gambling, construction, and trucking. Any industry where money moved in bulk, the Mafia found a way in. Take unions, for example. In cities like New York, unions were powerful, representing workers in construction, shipping, and transportation. If you controlled the unions, you controlled the flow of work. And if you controlled the flow of work, you controlled the money. The Mafia figured this out quickly. They infiltrated unions, placing loyal men in leadership roles. With that power, they could decide which companies got contracts and which ones didn't. Construction projects, skyscrapers, bridges, tunnels, all of them required union labor, and the Mafia made sure every dollar passed through their hands. Companies that refused to play along would find their projects stalled, their workers striking, or worse, their equipment mysteriously destroyed. This influence expanded into waste management, a business that might sound boring, but was incredibly profitable. Garbage collection in big cities is a massive operation. By controlling waste management contracts, the Mafia ensured steady, legal-looking streams of income while still being able to launder money from illegal operations. Cash-heavy businesses like strip clubs, bars, and casinos also became key to cleaning money. Every illegal dollar could be disguised as legitimate revenue, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace. As the decades rolled on, the Mafia's grip tightened. In the 1950s and 60s, investigations exposed just how deeply the mob was entrenched in American life. From Las Vegas, casinos built with mob money, to Hollywood productions financed with underworld cash, the reach of organized crime seemed endless. Politicians would occasionally try to crack down, but with every trial came witnesses too scared to testify, or evidence that mysteriously disappeared. The famous Senate hearings on organized crime in the 1950s revealed some of the truth to the public, but even then, the Mafia adapted. Every time law enforcement found one scheme, the mob created another. One of the smartest men to ever shape the Mafia was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He understood that endless violence only brought heat from the police. Instead, he built something called the Commission, a board of Mafia bosses from different families who worked together to regulate disputes in business. This wasn't about street fights anymore. This was organized crime, functioning like a Fortune 500 company. Luciano's model survived for decades, and in many ways, it still survives today. And that's the key to understanding the present. The Mafia doesn't need to fire bullets in the street anymore. They don't need shootouts that make headlines. What they need is silence. They thrive in the background, quietly moving money through industries most people never think about. When you walk past a construction site in New York, when you see a trash truck making its rounds, when you enter a casino or even hear about union disputes, the fingerprints of organized crime are often still there, just invisible to the casual observer. Think about the way money works in modern society. Big contracts worth millions, sometimes billions, are awarded to companies for building infrastructure. Who decides which companies get those contracts? Who gets to influence the unions? Who makes sure shipments move smoothly through the docks? These questions don't always have clean answers. And in that gray area, the mafia thrives. Because while governments have laws, organized crime has something more flexible: relationships. If a politician needs campaign donations, the mob can make it happen. If a company needs union workers to stay quiet, the mob can arrange it. And if a competitor needs to be pressured, the mob knows a dozen ways to make it happen without leaving a trace. Even in the 21st century, organized crime hasn't disappeared. It has simply modernized. Cybercrime, online betting, and international money laundering have replaced some of the old rackets. But the principle is the same. Find where the money flows, insert yourself into the pipeline, and take a cut. The mafia's genius was never in its violence. It was in its ability to adapt. The truth is, the mafia has always been about more than men in suits whispering in smoke-filled rooms. It's about a system that knows people will always drink, gamble, build, ship, and spend. A system that knows money will always move. And if you can control even a fraction of that flow, you hold power. That's why, even today, long after the headlines about Gotti, Capone, and Luciano have faded, the mafia's shadow still stretches across the world of money. The deeper you go into the world of organized crime, the more you realize that the mafia was never just a collection of criminals hiding in the shadows. It was and remains a system of influence that stretches into every corner of society. By the time law enforcement in the United States began to truly understand how deeply entrenched the mob was, it was already too late. The roots were in place, the networks were built, and the financial pipelines were flowing. If Chapter 1 was about how the mafia discovered its true power in controlling money, then Chapter 2 is about how that power became permanent, surviving raids, indictments, and the slow march of history itself. One of the greatest tricks the mafia ever pulled was convincing the public that it was all about street violence. That narrative, fed by newspapers, movies, and even some police reports, painted a picture of gangsters as hot-headed killers, flashy dressers, and nightclub showmen. John Gotti, with his designer suits and smug smile outside courtrooms, embodied this image. But while the public obsessed over the flamboyant mobsters, the real power brokers remained invisible. The men who moved the contracts, secured the unions, and managed the flow of money rarely appeared in headlines. They didn't want attention. They wanted results. During the mid-20th century, the mafia refined its grip over labor unions. This wasn't just about shaking down workers for dues. It was about positioning themselves as gatekeepers for some of the most important industries in America. Take the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, for example. The Teamsters represented truck drivers and warehouse workers, the people who quite literally kept the nation moving. By infiltrating the leadership of the union, the mafia gained the ability to control shipping, logistics, and distribution. This meant that everything from groceries to construction supplies to consumer goods could be delayed, rerouted, or even stopped, and if the mafia chose to pull the strings. Companies had no choice but to negotiate. In many cases, those negotiations came with envelopes of cash slid across tables, promises of loyalty, or threats of financial ruin if they refused. The infamous Jimmy Hoffa, president of the Teamsters in the 1950s and 60s, symbolizes this era. While Hoffa himself wasn't a made man, his ties to the Mafia ran deep. Mob families used his influence to secure loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund, pouring millions into projects like Las Vegas casinos. On the surface, these were legitimate business ventures. In reality, they were a way to launder money, generate profits, and keep the Mafia's empire running. The disappearance of Hoffa in 1975 remains one of America's most enduring mysteries, and many believe it was tied to these financial entanglements with organized crime. Las Vegas itself is another example of how the Mafia turned money into a weapon. In the early days of the Strip, casinos weren't run by corporations with glossy marketing campaigns. They were built and financed with mob money. Figures like Bugsy Siegel helped transform the desert into a playground of neon lights and endless gambling. For decades, the Mafia skimmed profits directly from casino operations. Before cash was counted, before records were made, a percentage was quietly siphoned off the top and sent back to crime families across the country. This system, known as the skim, poured untold millions into Mafia coffers, while the public marveled at the glitter of Las Vegas. But Las Vegas wasn't the only place where the mob left its fingerprints. Construction in major cities became another gold mine. From skyscrapers in New York to highways in Chicago, the Mafia learned that if you controlled the unions and the companies bidding on projects, you controlled the flow of billions of dollars. Bid rigging became a common practice where supposedly competitive construction companies would secretly agree on which one would win a contract. The winning company would then kick a percentage back to the Mafia, while the others would put in intentionally higher bids to make the process look legitimate. Taxpayers unknowingly funded these schemes, while mob families grew richer and richer. Perhaps the most genius element of the Mafia's financial empire was its ability to launder money. Laundering is the process of making dirty money gained from illegal activities appear legitimate. Imagine a mob family makes millions from illegal gambling operations. They can't just walk into a bank and deposit that money without raising suspicions. Instead, they funnel it through cash-heavy businesses, restaurants, bars, strip clubs, or even laundromats. These businesses report inflated revenues, masking the illegal cash as legitimate earnings. By the time the money enters the banking system, it looks clean. The mob perfected this process long before most law enforcement agencies even understood how it worked. International connections added another layer. Italian families in New York maintained strong ties with the Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra, as well as other European crime groups. Heroin trafficking became one of the most profitable ventures of the mid-20th century, with the infamous French Connection funneling drugs from Turkey through France and into the United States. The profits were astronomical, and once again, laundering operations turned drug money into investments in construction, shipping, and even legitimate corporations. The irony was striking. Some of America's most respected companies unknowingly built themselves on foundations of Mafia money. By the 1970s and 80s, the government finally began to strike back with new tools. The Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal organizations instead of just individuals. This was a game changer. Suddenly, the Mafia couldn't just sacrifice a soldier or capo to protect the boss. Entire families faced indictments. The FBI infiltrated mob circles with undercover agents like Joseph Pistone, better known as Donnie Brasco, who spent years inside the Bonanno family. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants brought down powerful figures like John Gotti, who had long evaded justice thanks to jury tampering and witness intimidation. Yet even with these victories, the Mafia didn't die. It adapted. Violence became less visible, but the financial influence never truly went away. Construction, waste management, trucking, shipping, and gambling remained fertile ground. In fact, while the FBI was focused on the 5 families of New York, other groups quietly expanded. The 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, Italy, for example, grew into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, controlling much of Europe's cocaine trade and laundering money through global finance. By the 21st century, experts estimated that organized crime groups like the 'Ndrangheta were generating revenues in the tens of billions, rivaling multinational corporations. In New York itself, Mafia families still maintained influence, though less flamboyant than before. Arrests in the 2000s and 2010s continued to reveal mob infiltration in construction companies, union leadership, and waste management contracts. One federal indictment described how mobsters controlled the price of hauling construction debris from building sites in Manhattan, effectively creating a cartel. Developers had no choice but to pay inflated rates, with the difference lining the pockets of organized crime families. Technology also opened new opportunities. Online sports betting, for example, created vast underground markets that the Mafia could exploit. Before states legalized sports gambling, countless Americans placed bets through illegal bookmaking operations run by organized crime. These bookies didn't operate independently. They were connected to larger networks managed by mob families who used the profits to fund other ventures. Even with legalization spreading, underground betting still thrives, often offering better odds or credit options that legal sports books won't touch. The Mafia knows that as long as there's demand, there's money to be made. Another modern frontier is cybercrime. While the traditional Mafia isn't known for high-tech operations, alliances with other criminal groups have opened doors to hacking, identity theft, and financial fraud. Money stolen through cybercrime needs to be laundered, and nobody understands laundering better than the mob. In some cases, traditional organized crime has partnered with newer, more technologically savvy criminals to keep pace with the digital age. The question, then, isn't whether the Mafia still controls money today. The question is how deeply that control runs, and whether ordinary people ever realize how often they brush against it without knowing. Every time a construction project is delayed, every time union disputes make headlines, every time a politician's campaign funding raises eyebrows, the shadow of organized crime may be closer than it appears. The Mafia doesn't need to announce itself. Its power is in being invisible and making sure money flows smoothly while always taking a cut from the stream. In the end, the Mafia's story isn't one of decline, but of evolution. The days of Tommy guns and street wars may be over, but the days of financial control are far from finished. What began as protection rackets in Sicilian villages grew into one of the most sophisticated systems of financial manipulation in modern history. From the streets of New York to the casinos of Las Vegas, from the docks of New Jersey to the boardrooms of Europe, the Mafia has proven one thing again and again. As long as money moves, so does the mob. And in a world where money never stops, their power may be eternal. The story of the Mafia is not just about how it built power, but about how it kept it, even when the world around it changed. By the time the 1990s arrived, law enforcement had spent decades trying to dismantle organized crime in America. The high-profile trials of bosses like John Gotti gave the impression that the mob was finally being brought to its knees. But history has a way of proving that appearances are often deceptive. The Mafia was never truly defeated. It merely adapted. And in the shadows of globalization, technology, and new markets, it found ways to reinvent itself and continue controlling money in ways most people never notice. To understand this evolution, it helps to look at the psychology of organized crime. Violence in the early days was a tool of survival. In the streets of Little Italy or the alleys of Chicago, gangsters had to show power through fear. A man who defied the mob might find his business burned down or his body left in a gutter. But once power was established, once entire industries were under control, violence became a liability. Shootouts drew headlines. Blood in the streets attracted law enforcement. Smart mobsters realized that silence was worth more than spectacle. A bribe could move mountains where a bullet could only leave a corpse. This was the philosophy that carried the Mafia into the modern era. By the 1990s and 2000s, crime families had stopped trying to dominate the headlines and instead focused on quietly embedding themselves into industries that looked respectable. Waste management, trucking, construction, shipping, and even finance. All of these remained fertile ground. The FBI's RICO cases may have sent many bosses and capos to prison, but the institutions they built, the networks they created, survived. Let's take construction again as an example. In New York City, construction is constant. Skyscrapers rise, apartment buildings expand, and infrastructure projects never stop. Billions of dollars flow into this industry every year. Developers, contractors, unions, and suppliers all play their roles in the process. Into this web, the Mafia inserted itself like a spider. They didn't have to control every company, just enough to influence the flow of contracts. Bid rigging, extortion, and kickbacks remained common well into the 2000s. Investigations revealed that mob families could fix the price of cement, control which companies got demolition contracts, and inflate costs by millions. For developers, the message was simple. Pay up, and your project moves forward. Resist, and your project is stalled. Workers go on strike, or supplies mysteriously disappear. Even when law enforcement cracked down on these schemes, new ones emerged. Instead of overtly threatening companies, mobsters began using more subtle tactics. They positioned associates in union leadership, giving them control over work crews. They partnered with seemingly legitimate businessmen who could front contracts. They created layers of shell companies to mask true ownership. By the time investigators traced the money, it had already passed through so many hands that proving Mafia involvement became a monumental task. Another area where the Mafia continued to thrive was gambling. Even as Las Vegas became corporate and regulated, illegal gambling remained a major source of revenue. Sports betting, poker rooms, and underground casinos flourished in cities across America. In neighborhoods where trust in institutions was low, people turned to the mob for credit, loans, and places to gamble without oversight. The beauty of gambling for the mafia was its simplicity. People always want to bet. The house always wins, and the profits are steady. When states began legalizing sports betting in the 2010s, many assumed this would finally end the mafia's grip on the market. But in truth, legalization only created new opportunities. Illegal bookmakers could offer better odds, extend credit, and avoid taxes, keeping their operations alive even as legal sports books expanded. Loan sharking also remained a cornerstone of mafia income. Banks and legitimate lenders have strict requirements. But the mob has always been willing to lend money to those who can't get it elsewhere, at a price. The interest rates are crushing, and the consequences for failing to pay are dire. But for desperate business owners or gamblers in debt, the mafia often feels like the only option. These loans create a cycle of dependency that keeps people tied to the mob indefinitely. Even today, federal investigations occasionally uncover loan sharking operations tied to mafia families, proving that this old-school racket still works in the modern age. Waste management, often mocked in movies as a cliché mob front, remains a critical industry. Garbage collection in major cities is not just about picking up trash. It's about contracts worth millions. By controlling waste disposal companies, the mafia ensured steady cash flow and opportunities to launder money. Federal cases in the 2000s exposed how mob-controlled waste companies colluded to divide up territories, forcing businesses to pay inflated rates. To the average citizen, it looked like nothing more than the cost of doing business. But behind the scenes, it was another pipeline of steady income for organized crime. What's most fascinating is how the mafia expanded beyond traditional industries. By the late 20th century, globalization created new opportunities. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Neapolitan Camorra, and the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta extended their reach across Europe, Africa, and South America. Cocaine trafficking, in particular, became a global business. The 'Ndrangheta rose to dominate much of the trade, partnering with South American cartels and using European ports as entry points. Estimates suggest that this single group generates tens of billions of dollars annually, money that flows into legitimate businesses across the globe. Luxury hotels, restaurants, shipping companies, and even financial institutions have all been tainted by laundered mafia money. This globalization also affected American families. Ties between U.S. mobsters and their European counterparts strengthened, allowing money and influence to cross borders with ease. Modern organized crime is not limited by geography. It's not just about New York or Chicago anymore. It's about a worldwide network of relationships, investments, and schemes. Technology added another layer to this evolution. While the mafia was slow to adopt digital tools compared to some criminal organizations, it eventually recognized the opportunities. Cybercrime became a new frontier. Hackers who stole identities, credit card numbers, or bank credentials often needed ways to move or clean the money. The mafia, with its century of experience in laundering, became a natural partner. Reports have surfaced of mobsters partnering with cyber criminals to launder digital profits through shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Cryptocurrency in particular has become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers anonymity and the ability to move funds across borders quickly. On the other, blockchain technology leaves digital trails that authorities can follow. The Mafia has experimented with both sides, sometimes using crypto to move funds, other times investing in businesses that convert digital profits into physical assets, like real estate. The key, as always, is to stay ahead of law enforcement just long enough to secure the profits and move on to the next scheme. Politics, too, remains a battleground. The Mafia has always known that money buys influence, and influence protects money. Campaign donations, lobbying, and quiet partnerships with corrupt officials have allowed organized crime to shield itself from scrutiny. In some cases, mob families don't need to directly bribe politicians anymore. Instead, they fund intermediaries, businesses, or unions that provide the support, keeping their fingerprints off the process. The result is the same. Contracts flow in their direction, investigations stall, and the system remains tilted in their favor. The resilience of the Mafia comes from its ability to evolve without abandoning its core principles. Loyalty, silence, and adaptability have always defined the mob. Even as families weakened under the pressure of law enforcement, the culture remained intact. Younger generations, sometimes less disciplined than their fathers and grandfathers, still inherit the networks, the relationships, and the opportunities. Law enforcement may arrest a boss, but another man always steps up to take his place. The structure, though battered, endures. And so the Mafia's influence over money continues in ways both obvious and invisible. In construction sites, in shipping ports, in casinos, in nightclubs, in online betting platforms, and even in the seemingly boring world of waste disposal, the mob's shadow lingers. You may never meet a mobster. You may never see their work firsthand. But every time money changes hands in industries they touch, there's a chance a silent partner is taking a cut. That is the true genius of the Mafia. Not its violence, not its glamour, but its ability to insert itself into the everyday flow of money in ways most people never question. It has outlasted prohibition, survived government crackdowns, adapted to globalization, and embraced technology. And as long as human nature demands gambling, loans, shortcuts, and profit, the Mafia will always find a way to stand at the crossroads of desire and opportunity, ready to collect its share. The story, then, is not about whether the mob still controls money today. It is about the fact that it never stopped. It simply grew quieter, smarter, and more invisible. The headlines may focus on fallen bosses and flashy trials, but the real Mafia, the one that controls contracts, manipulates unions, launders billions, and invests in industries that touch everyday life, remains alive. Hidden, patient, and eternal, it proves a simple truth. Empires built on money do not die. They adapt. By the early 21st century, the Mafia faced a world more complicated than at any point in its history. The days when a boss could control an entire city with a few unions, a handful of businesses, and a reputation for violence were fading. Surveillance technology, aggressive prosecutors, and international cooperation made it harder for mobsters to operate the way their predecessors had. Yet, despite all these challenges, the Mafia endured, not by clinging to the past, but by reshaping its methods for a new age. Chapter 4 of this story is about that transformation, how the mob adapted to modern capitalism, how it found ways to blend into global markets, and how it remained relevant even when many believed it had finally been buried. To understand this stage of evolution, one must first recognize the mafia's survival instincts. At its heart, organized crime has always thrived on invisibility. In the Roaring Twenties, invisibility meant speakeasies hidden behind restaurant doors. In the 1950s, it meant silent control over unions and labor. In the 1980s, it meant bribing inspectors, hiding ownership, and disguising profits through fronts. By the 2000s, invisibility took on new forms. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, and international investments became the camouflage. What once was accomplished with a handshake in a backroom was now done with paperwork, bank transfers, and accountants who spoke the language of Wall Street. Consider real estate. For the mafia, real estate has always been more than property. It has been a tool for laundering and multiplying wealth. In cities like Miami, New York, and Los Angeles, mob-tied investors pour dirty money into luxury condos, commercial buildings, and development projects. The beauty of real estate is that it legitimizes even the dirtiest cash. A pile of untraceable bills from gambling, drugs, or extortion can be converted into a condominium unit on the waterfront. Later, when that unit is sold, the money is clean. No bullets, no headlines, just paperwork filed at the county clerk's office. By the 2010s, investigators noted how criminal groups across the globe, not just the American mafia, but also cartels, oligarchs, and foreign syndicates, used real estate as their favorite laundromat. The mafia, once mocked as old-fashioned, proved it was perfectly capable of playing in this global game. Entertainment also became a playground. While the Hollywood portrayals of mobsters were filled with cliches, the real story was quieter. Nightclubs, strip clubs, bars, and concert venues gave the mob access to both cash and influence. Cash-based businesses are notoriously hard to track, making them perfect for hiding illicit profits. Moreover, these venues offered another valuable resource: connections. Politicians, celebrities, and business executives often mingled in the same places. For a mobster, owning or controlling these establishments meant access to networks that could be leveraged for favors. A politician who owes you for campaign donations, a celebrity whose reputation you can protect, a businessman who wants his club to thrive. These relationships are as valuable as any money-making racket. At the same time, the mafia recognized that narcotics, though dangerous, remained too lucrative to ignore. The American mafia had traditionally been cautious with drugs. Bosses like Paul Castellano feared that narcotics attracted too much heat from the government, but their younger counterparts were not as restrained. Cocaine in the 1980s, heroin in the 1990s, and synthetic drugs in the 2000s provided billions in profits. Even when American families attempted to stay on the margins, their Sicilian and Calabrian relatives were knee-deep in the trade. The 'Ndrangheta, in particular, transformed itself into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world through its grip on cocaine trafficking. American mobsters benefited from these relationships, whether through direct supply or profit-sharing arrangements. The drug money flowing into Europe, South America, and North America created endless opportunities for laundering, investment, and expansion. But it was not just drugs. The mafia saw opportunity in every human weakness. Gambling remained steady. Loan sharking never disappeared. And new vices, online betting, cyber scams, even counterfeit goods, became part of the portfolio. The counterfeit market was particularly attractive. Everything from fake luxury handbags to pirated DVDs to counterfeit pharmaceuticals could be moved at enormous profit margins. For the consumer, the risk was low. Few thought twice about buying a cheap fake purse or discounted software. For the mafia, the profit was enormous, and the penalties, compared to narcotics, were light. In a world where global trade moved billions of containers across oceans every year, slipping counterfeit goods into the flow was easier than ever. Yet none of these rackets could have survived without money laundering. Laundering has always been the lifeblood of organized crime, the alchemy that transforms dirty profits into respectable wealth. By the 2000s, the sophistication of laundering schemes rivaled those of multinational corporations. Offshore banks in the Caribbean, trusts in Panama, accounts in Switzerland, and investments in Hong Kong all became part of the mob's financial web. Cryptocurrencies added another layer of complexity. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital assets gave criminals a way to move funds instantly and pseudonymously. While law enforcement eventually developed tools to track blockchain transactions, the learning curve was steep, and mobsters exploited it. They diversified their laundering methods: real estate, casinos, art markets, shell companies, luxury goods, and crypto exchanges all became pieces of the puzzle. And then there was politics. For all their adaptability, mobsters never forgot that protection from the state was priceless. Whether through bribery, campaign donations, or quiet favors, the mafia ensured that politicians, regulators, and law enforcement officers could be influenced. Sometimes this influence was direct, a bribe handed over in exchange for a blind eye. Other times it was subtle, a donation through intermediaries, a loan to a struggling businessman who later became a city council member, or a job given to the relative of a powerful figure. The result was the same. The mafia bought time, protection, and access. It is no coincidence that certain contracts, zoning approvals, and government projects seem to repeatedly benefit mob-connected companies. Influence may not have the glamour of a shootout in the street, but it has far more staying power. As the decades moved forward, the mafia also faced new competition. Cartels from Mexico, gangs from Eastern Europe, and syndicates from Asia began carving out their own empires in America and abroad. But rather than disappearing, the mafia adapted by partnering. The Italian-American mob never had the size or ruthlessness of the cartels, but it had what the cartels lacked: infrastructure, experience, and political connections. In some cases, mobsters acted as middlemen, helping cartels launder money or move drugs through established ports. In others, they provided logistical support. Trucking companies, warehouses, shipping routes that had been under their control for generations. The mafia was no longer the undisputed king of crime, but it was a respected broker, a player that could not be ignored. The irony of this era is that while the mafia seemed quieter, its reach grew more subtle and enduring. News headlines about mob bosses became rarer. The days of flamboyant figures like Gotti were gone. Instead, low-profile bosses, often older men with business degrees, ran families like corporations. They spoke less about making bones and more about market share. Their goal was not fame, but longevity. This was perhaps the greatest lesson of the past century. The bosses who sought attention often fell quickly, while those who stayed in the shadows endured. The public, for the most part, assumed the mafia was gone. Television shows and movies romanticized the past, making the mob feel like a relic of another era. But the reality was that the mafia had simply learned that invisibility was its greatest weapon. Every time a skyscraper went up, every time a nightclub opened, every time a real estate deal closed, there was a chance that somewhere, hidden in the fine print, a mobster's hand was present. And unlike the days of shootouts and speakeasies, these modern mobsters were content to let the profits flow without ever making the front page. What this chapter of the Mafia's history teaches us is simple. Organized crime, like capitalism itself, adapts. It seeks out inefficiencies, exploits weaknesses, and thrives where regulation fails. Whether through construction, real estate, drugs, counterfeit goods, or digital currencies, the mob finds a way to insert itself. Not because it is invincible, but because the forces that create demand, greed, addiction, ambition are eternal. And as long as those forces exist, the mafia will endure, reshaping itself for each new generation while keeping its roots firmly planted in the shadows of money. The empire built on crime is not one that shouts its existence from rooftops. It is one that whispers, that waits, that grows quietly where no one is looking. And in the 21st century, as global finance became ever more complex, those whispers became harder to hear, harder to trace, and harder to stop. That is how the mob survived. That is how it continues to thrive. And that is why, no matter how many headlines declare its death, the truth remains the same. The mafia never left. It simply learned to disappear. The story of the mafia in the modern age is as much about perception as it is about reality. To most people, the mob is something that belongs to the past. Black and white photographs of Al Capone, tabloid stories of John Gotti strutting down Mulberry Street, or Hollywood films that turned wise guys into cultural icons. When the average American thinks of organized crime, it often feels like an echo of a bygone era, a relic of the 20th century. But beneath that perception lies a reality that is far less romantic and far more enduring. The mafia is still here, still earning, and still woven into the financial fabric of societies both in America and abroad. And in this final chapter of their story, we see how they have not only survived, but also thrived in silence. The key to understanding this persistence lies in the quiet ways the mafia has embedded itself in everyday life. Consider the supply chain that brings goods into a major American city. At every step, ports, trucking companies, warehouses, construction of distribution centers, there are opportunities for influence. The mob does not need to control everything. It only needs to control enough. A single union boss, a few strategically placed companies, a handful of front businesses, all of these create leverage. That leverage means contracts can be steered, competitors can be squeezed out, and profits can be siphoned quietly. For the average consumer buying groceries, electronics, or clothes, the mafia's cut is invisible. Yet the dollars add up, and they continue to flow year after year. Take the ports, for example. The Port of New York and New Jersey has long been a hub not only of legitimate trade, but also of organized crime activity. Investigations throughout the 2000s and 2010s revealed that crime families still influenced hiring, controlled trucking routes, and in some cases dictated which companies could operate without harassment. The globalization of trade, which brought billions in goods through these ports, did not eliminate the mob's presence. It amplified the opportunities. Cargo theft, smuggling, and manipulation of shipping logistics all provided ways to make money. And as the shipping industry became more complex, with layers of subcontractors and international partners, the mafia found new ways to hide its fingerprints. Construction, always a cornerstone of mafia income, also continued to serve as fertile ground. Even as federal monitors attempted to root out corruption in unions and bidding processes, mobsters adapted. Shell companies allowed them to secure contracts under different names. Associates without criminal records served as the public face of businesses. When authorities cracked down in one area, the mob simply shifted to another. The resilience of this system comes from its adaptability. Organized crime does not need to dominate an entire industry. It needs only to insert itself into enough corners to guarantee steady revenue. The skyscrapers that rise over Manhattan or the new developments in Brooklyn often carry invisible costs. Contracts padded with mob influence, concrete poured by companies tied to crime families, or inspection approvals quietly secured by bribes. The entertainment world also remained entangled with organized crime in ways most people never realized. Nightclubs, restaurants, music venues, and strip clubs are often cash-heavy businesses, and cash-heavy businesses are perfect for laundering money. The mafia's presence in these industries is not always about making money from the business itself. It's about using the business as a financial sponge to soak up illicit profits and release them as clean revenue. At the same time, control of nightlife brings access to networks of influence. Celebrities, politicians, business magnates all pass through these spaces. And in the mob's world, relationships are as valuable as dollars. A favor owed, a connection made, a debt quietly recorded. These are the threads that weave organized crime into the fabric of society. In recent years, one of the most striking examples of mafia adaptability has been its engagement with global finance. The old image of mobsters carrying envelopes of cash is outdated. Today, laundering can involve international bank transfers, offshore trusts, cryptocurrency, and investment in legitimate businesses. The art world, for instance, has become a favored tool. Works of art can be bought and sold for millions with little oversight, providing a convenient way to move money across borders. Cryptocurrencies, too, have offered both opportunities and challenges. While blockchain records transactions, anonymity still allows creative criminals to exploit the system. Reports suggest that mafia families have experimented with using crypto wallets to move illicit profits before channeling them into real estate or shell corporations. In this way, the mob shows that it is not an artifact of the past, but an evolving player in the modern economy. Yet perhaps the greatest strength of the mafia is not its ability to earn, but its ability to endure. Law enforcement has arrested bosses, dismantled families, and won convictions in court. Time and again, headlines have declared the mafia finished, but time and again, the organization reemerges. This resilience stems from its structure and its culture. The mafia is not a single man or a single family. It is a network, a tradition, a set of relationships that pass from one generation to the next. Even when a boss falls, there is always someone waiting to step up. Even when one racket collapses, another emerges. Like water, it adapts to whatever container it is poured into. Part of this endurance comes from the silence that defines the code of omerta. Though weakened in recent decades by turncoats and government witnesses, the culture of silence remains powerful. Families instill loyalty, and betrayal carries consequences. Those who do cooperate with authorities often face exile, constant fear, and the destruction of the lives they once knew. The risk of breaking silence still outweighs the benefits for many. And so the Mafia continues to operate not in the loud and bloody style of the past, but in the quiet persistence of tradition. There. It is important to recognize, too, that the Mafia does not always need to dominate headlines to remain effective. In fact, its greatest victories are the ones nobody notices. A rigged contract that never makes the news. A bribe paid that never comes to light. A business quietly absorbed into the mob's portfolio. These are the small, invisible wins that sustain organized crime. And they are the reason why, even when law enforcement claims success, the Mafia never truly disappears. Globally, the Mafia's American branches remain connected to their European counterparts. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Neapolitan Camorra, and the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta have expanded into multinational enterprises. They traffic cocaine, control ports, and invest in legitimate businesses across continents. The American mob, though weaker than its peak, benefits from these connections. Partnerships in narcotics, laundering, and logistics keep the families relevant. The world of organized crime is no longer bound by geography. It is an interconnected web that stretches from New York to Calabria, from Miami to South America, from ports in Europe to banks in Asia. And yet, despite all this complexity, the Mafia's essence remains unchanged. It is about power, money, and silence. It is about exploiting human desires, gambling, drugs, easy money, and human weaknesses, greed, fear, ambition. It is about taking a cut without ever being seen. The names may change, the rackets may evolve, but the core remains the same. The Mafia's true genius has always been its ability to adapt without losing its identity. For the average person, the Mafia might seem irrelevant, a story from history books or Hollywood films. But the reality is more unsettling. Every time you walk through a construction site, every time you see a cargo ship docking at a port, every time a nightclub opens with investors no one can quite identify, you may be closer to the mob than you realize. Not in the way the movies portray it, with gangsters in sharp suits demanding protection money, but in the quiet way money moves behind the scenes, invisible yet ever present. And this is perhaps the most enduring truth of all. The Mafia does not need you to see it. In fact, it thrives because you don't. The less attention, the better. It is not about making headlines. It is about making money. And as long as money flows, as long as there are markets to exploit and weaknesses to manipulate, the Mafia will never truly die. It will simply fade into the background, becoming part of the machinery of modern capitalism. Hidden, patient, eternal. The history of the Mafia is not a closed book. It is a story still being written, in the contracts signed today, in the investments made tomorrow, in the networks of influence that continue to operate in silence. For those willing to look closely, the signs are everywhere. But for most, the Mafia remains invisible, and that is exactly how it wants to be. As we close this journey into the hidden world of the Mafia, it is worth stepping back to see the entire picture. What began as a story of desperate immigrants in the back alleys of America grew into one of the most enduring criminal empires in modern history. For over a century, The Mafia has adapted, survived, and embedded itself in society in ways most people never see. To the casual observer, it may appear to be gone, reduced to a set of legends, movies, and faded headlines. But as we've uncovered through this series, the reality is far more complex. The Mafia has never disappeared. It has only grown quieter, smarter, and more invisible. In Chapter 1, we traced the Mafia's origins in America. We looked at how the sons of Sicilian immigrants carved out power in neighborhoods where poverty and prejudice created fertile ground for crime. Violence, extortion, and protection rackets gave them control of the streets, while Prohibition turned them into kings. The illegal liquor trade provided staggering wealth and laid the foundations for a system of organized crime that would outlast its earliest architects. Men like Al Capone became household names, but behind them was a machinery of corruption, bribery, and influence that proved far more enduring than any single gangster. Chapter 2 carried us into the mid-20th century, when the Mafia perfected its empire. From labor unions to construction, from casinos to loan sharking, the mob found ways to insert itself into the American economy. They were not simply thugs with guns. They were businessmen, albeit ruthless ones, who understood that steady revenue was more valuable than flashy violence. This was the golden age of the mob, when bosses like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino designed systems that allowed their families to thrive in near invisibility. Violence was used sparingly, and money was the true weapon. It was in this period that the Mafia began to understand its true power, not just the ability to terrify, but the ability to control. In Chapter 3, we examined the challenges the Mafia faced as law enforcement turned its full attention toward dismantling the families. The RICO Act, surveillance, and aggressive prosecutions sent bosses to prison and forced crime families to adapt. Yet even under this pressure, the Mafia endured by shifting strategies. Gambling, loan sharking, construction, and waste management remained pillars of income, but new opportunities arose. Globalization opened doors to narcotics trafficking, counterfeit goods, and international laundering schemes. Technology added another dimension as mobsters experimented with cybercrime and cryptocurrency. The Mafia proved that it was not stuck in the past. It could evolve with the times, finding new ways to profit from the changing world. Chapter 4 revealed how the Mafia embedded itself deeper into modern capitalism. Real estate became a powerful tool for laundering billions. Ports, shipping, and global supply chains provided endless opportunities for influence and theft. The entertainment industry offered both cash-heavy businesses and access to networks of power. The art market, crypto exchanges, and offshore finance allowed illicit profits to be cleaned and reinvested. By staying quiet, avoiding the flamboyance of figures like John Gotti, the Mafia became harder to detect. Its leaders learned that invisibility was the true path to survival. Where once they ruled with fear in the streets, now they thrived by whispering in boardrooms and hiding behind paperwork. In Chapter 5, we confronted the enduring truth. The Mafia never died. Despite headlines declaring its demise, it remains alive in contracts, unions, shipping routes, and nightclubs. It is not the dominant force it once was, but it does not need to be. Organized crime today thrives in the shadows of legitimate business, taking small cuts that add up to billions. Its true genius has always been its ability to adapt without abandoning its essence. Greed, power, silence. These are eternal human forces, and as long as they exist, so too will the Mafia. When we put all of these chapters together, a clear picture emerges. The Mafia is not simply an artifact of history or a glamorous image from Hollywood. It is a living, breathing system of organized crime that has shaped economies, influenced politics, and adapted to the challenges of every new era. Its roots run deep in America, but its branches extend across the globe, linking with other syndicates and criminal networks. Whether through gambling dens in the 1920s, construction unions in the 1950s, drug routes in the 1980s, or crypto wallets in the 2020s, the Mafia has remained at the crossroads of money and power. So, what does this mean for us today? It means that every time we talk about corruption, about rigged contracts, about unexplained wealth, there is a chance the Mafia is somewhere in the background. It means that the costs of construction projects, the price of waste disposal, the ownership of certain nightclubs or real estate developments may be shaped by invisible hands. It means that the Mafia is not something you meet in a back alley. It is something that moves silently within the systems we take for granted. And it also means that declaring the Mafia finished is a mistake. Organized crime, by its nature, adapts. Law enforcement may win battles, but the war never ends. For every boss who falls, another rises. For every racket exposed, another emerges. The Mafia has survived Prohibition, survived the FBI's war in the 1980s, survived globalization, and now even survives in the age of digital surveillance. Its survival is proof of a simple fact. As long as there is money to be made in the shadows, someone will always step in to claim it. The lesson of this story is not just about crime. It is about human nature. The Mafia is a mirror held up to society, reflecting our desires, our greed, and our weaknesses. People will always want to gamble, to take shortcuts, to find money when no bank will lend it. People will always be drawn to power, always tempted by corruption, always willing to look the other way if the price is right. The Mafia exists because we allow it to, because it fills the cracks in the system that no one else can or will. And so, as we close this exploration, we are left with the paradox. The Mafia is invisible, yet everywhere. It is weaker than before, yet still powerful. It is ancient in its traditions, yet modern in its methods. It is an empire without borders, without flags, without armies, yet one that endures longer than many governments and corporations. It is a shadow that stretches across history, adapting to every new dawn, never fully vanishing. The final truth is this: the Mafia is not just part of the past. It is part of the present. And unless something changes in human nature itself, it will be part of the future. For as long as there is money to control, power to wield, and silence to hide behind, the mob will remain. Not in the headlines, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, where it has always thrived.